If you spend much time at all on the Facebook groups and related subreddits, you know that there's no shortage of questions from people asking how to get into modular synthesis. That's probably why you're watching this video right now. I find myself giving the same advice a lot, and since I have a YouTube channel and all, I figured I'd make a video or two about how to get started. A warning though, this is very much based on my own experiences, interests, and background. Your experience may not be the same, but I do feel like it's still pretty solid advice. Also, I'm in no way sponsored by Moog, I'm just a fan. I'm going to do this in 4 parts. First, I'm going to tell you how I got started, then why I think the Mother 32 is a good place for you to start, why it's good as a long-term part of your modular setup, and then I'm going to end with several minutes of sound demos and some patching notes. So I'd been an electronic music nut forever, and that often leads into being sort of a synth guy, and that's where I was for years. I didn't have any real music education, I never learned to play the piano or anything, so my efforts never really amounted to much. I was fairly familiar with basic subtractive and FM synthesis architectures, and I had done some cut and paste stuff on the computer, but that was it. All this time, the modular scene was really starting to grow, but I didn't know about it yet. So after a few years I got that familiar hankering to muck around with synths again, and this time it all fell into place. And that's sort of where I assume a lot of you are now. You probably know a little bit about synths, maybe you've made some music on the computer, and then something about modular caught your eye and now you're excited to get started. But how do you even do that? There are hundreds of new modules released every year, a lot of old favorites, a lot of new hotness. It's easy to get paralyzed with all the options that are open to you. You may have already spent hours on Modular Grid putting together dream racks. As good a resource as Modular Grid is, I personally think that's a really bad hole to go down when you're trying to get started. And I say that for a few reasons. One, you don't really know what you need yet. I can guarantee you whatever you think you want now is going to change very quickly. Number 2, you don't really know how things work yet. Many modules are super deep and have multiple modes and features. Buying a bunch of deep modules is a good way to get frustrated early on. Heck, I already have 4 videos on maths, and it has no modes at all, but you can spend weeks exploring just it. And finally, a lot of things that are on Modular Grid you can't really get anymore, and it's no use making plans around something you'll never find. So how do you start? Well, this is my story. The name Moog always loomed large over the world of synths, and like many synth fans, I had lusted after one, even if I didn't know how to use it. In 2015 or so, a friend and coworker kept nudging me towards this new offering, the Mother 32. I was kind of iffy on it, thinking it was just a toy, this little black box with some basic innards. But every time I went back to look at it over the months, it started to grow on me, until finally I convinced myself and I went out and bought one. And I already had an old 80s era digital effects rack mount by Yamaha that I picked up cheap somewhere. So that was my first setup, the Mother 32 sitting atop this rack mount effects unit, and I spent uncounted hours exploring it. Followed tutorials, learning how to patch it, discovering how the effects really opened it up. I even got half decent at playing the silly little chiclet keyboard. And I loved it, and after waiting what I hoped was a restrained period of time, my next purchase was another Mother 32. I felt that I still hadn't fully figured everything out, and I was really interested in learning how to cross-patch them and play with the FM possibilities and so on. And that was it. I was hooked, and I haven't looked back since. So obviously I'm a fan, and I felt it was a good way to get started, and I think it's good for other people, and it comes down to a few basic reasons. 1, it sounds awesome. There's a reason people talk about the Moog sound. Add a little reverb or echo and the thing comes alive. 2, it was familiar. Subtractive synthesis may not be the most interesting way to make beeping noises, but the terminology was familiar. Oscillator, noise source, filter, envelope generator, voltage-controlled amplifier, LFO, etc. I had an immediate familiarity with how it worked, and if I hadn't known anything, then it would have taught me a lot about the standard terminology. 3, it had everything I needed to get started. Beside the synthesis components, it adds a couple of standard modular utilities, like a multiple and an attenuator or crossfader or voltage generator. It has a tiny little keyboard to interact with and a step sequencer. I personally hate the sequencer, but when it's all I had, it was awesome. It even comes with a few patch cables. It also has MIDI interactivity, which wasn't as important to me, but it might be for you. And of course it has its own power and you don't need to worry about sound levels to start. 4, it's relatively inexpensive. As of making this video, a new Mother 32 is about $700 US, but it won't take long to find one used. I just did a quick check and found one for $500. And if you've already been pricing things out, you know things can get out of hand pretty quickly. First, you need a rack and power. Then you're going to need an oscillator and a filter, maybe a noise source, a mixer to add it all together, a VCA, envelope generator, LFO, get a mult and an attenuator in there, and a sequencer to drive the whole thing. It adds up pretty fast, and it can rocket right past the price of a new Mother 32. And 5, it's semi-modular, which means it's pre-wired or normaled. It has a signal path that when you first turn it on, it's already ready to make noises. But it also does a decent job of breaking out those components and making them patchable. The two waveforms have their own outputs and can be mixed together if you want. The LFO is voltage controllable, the filter has control over both the cutoff and resonance, you can bring in external audio and mix it in, and so on. Yeah, those 32 patch points are a bit limited, but personally I think that's important when you get started because you can actually learn what they do and not get too overwhelmed. So those are all good reasons to start with the Mother 32, but how is it going to grow with you as you move further into modular? Well, of course, it still sounds amazing. I have a dozen different oscillators and sound sources, but the Mothers are the one I come back to the most often. And I actually found it really useful as a way to figure out what to buy next. After a couple of months playing with the two M32s, I had a pretty good idea of the limitations that bothered me. I wanted to know what a new filter sounded like. I wanted some slower modulation. I wanted an LFO that was triggerable. So that's what I bought. First, I bought a tip-top happy ending kit for the rack, a triggerable LFO by Depfer, the Harvestman Polyvox filter, and a triple sloth. I already knew where I felt constrained, and I was able to research options. So I started with those 3 modules, and then about 100 more, but that's a different story. Also important, I think, is that it can be racked up with all the other Eurorack stuff. It supports standard Eurorack power, everything is sized right. Yeah, it's pretty big, and I find I go back and forth between keeping them racked up and putting them back in their stock enclosures as my available rack sizes grows and shrinks. But the fact that I can do it makes it score a fair bit higher than some of the other semi-modular alternatives. And especially when it's racked up, I find myself using the utility surprisingly often. If I need a simple LFO, there's one right there. If I need a mult, it has one, or a crossfader or a noise source. It truly does become part of the modular setup. Just in general, I've never felt that I've outgrown them. They're a core part of my setup and my sound, and if the right deal crossed my path, I'd probably buy a third. So that's my story. Modular synthesis is such a broad topic, and especially if you're starting out brand new here, I think a Mother 32 makes for a very easy introduction. So coming up next, there are a few minutes of me exploring the Mother 32, along with the cheapest guitar pedal I could find on Amazon, and if you want a sense of what the M32 can sound like, stick around. But I hope you found this video helpful, and if you made it this far, maybe consider subscribing. Thanks.